Okay, thank you very much indeed, Simon, and thank you everyone for coming here to listen. I'm going to talk just very briefly about the development agenda, sort of from first principles, being basically an academic at heart, to always try, I suppose, to go back to the underpinnings of whatever it is that we're trying to do. And what I want to talk about basically is economic growth in low-income countries, and to what extent we can expect G20 to do anything about it. Why G20 and development? The G20 has committed itself to the development agenda. It is actually part of its legitimacy, I think, as well as having a sort of central role in the notion of balanced growth, strong, sustainable and balanced growth. Sharing with the 100 or so countries who are at the bottom of the pile seems to be a very important part of that. Thinking about what G20 can do, G20 is not the first organisation to think it has an interest in development from an international point of view, and so one wants to think, what is it that G20 can contribute? And so part of where we're trying to get to is to ask, what's the comparative advantage that G20 might have relative to various other players? The role of growth. Why are we bothering about growth? Growth is the sort of central driver of poverty reduction, sustained poverty reduction, long spells. Something like 80% of the difference across countries in the reduction in poverty over the latter quarter of the 20th century was due to differences in growth of average incomes. Also, of course, growth is the thing that delivers the resources for the MDGs, both to households, their incomes go up, and to public sectors who benefit from tax. Think back to the early 2000s when we were probably rather hubristic, but think about the aspirations that we started to get for low-income countries. For the first time in several decades, African countries maybe could think about serious reductions in poverty, about serious increases in growth in incomes per head. In a sense, what we're asking is, or what I'm proposing is, let's try and get back to that world where for the low-income countries, those sorts of growth rates are not dreams as they were over the 80s and 90s, but actuality. The growth story for low-income countries actually is moderately complex. And three things I want to talk about. First, heterogeneity across countries. Second, selection effects. I'll explain that as I go along. And thirdly, thinking about downturns. Not only underlying growth rates, but downturns, the frequency and the depth of them. First, the heterogeneity. This is a large sample of the countries that are currently viewed by the IMF as being low-income countries. And the little blue line up the middle is the median growth rate. It's the rate of growth that has 50% of the countries above and 50% of the countries below. The two lines on the outside are the quartiles, so that 25% of countries have growth rates above the top line, 25% of countries have growth rates below the bottom one. The thing to notice is a huge spread. All right, low-income countries are hugely diverse. The other thing to notice is that after about 1997, all of this relationship seems to shift up. That's the sort of the opportunity that we're seeking to sort of extend. Second thing that I want to talk about is the history of growth of the low-income countries. And this is based on some work that we have been doing in DFID. And it's based on a sample not of all low-income countries, but of 82 countries, including current definitions, 19 low-income countries, for which we can get data from the very early 60s to 2007. And we've broken them up into the groups that the World Bank recognizes: low, lower middle, upper middle, and high-income countries. And we've asked, what's the mean growth rate over the period from 1961 to 2007 for these groups? And if you look, the number that I've put a little oval around for the low-income countries that we've got at the moment is 0.23%. Over 50 years, nearly 50 years, hardly grew at all. That seems to be, as it were, the problem. Look at the other countries averaging year on year more than 2%. Let me direct you also to the column to the right of that, and that's the standard deviation. This is how much each country's growth varies within its own experience over the years. And there you can see that the variation is higher for low-income countries, standard deviation of 6 percentage points, dropping down to 3.5 percentage points for the high-income countries. low-income countries on this picture, our current set of low-income countries, seem to hardly grow at all and have hugely volatile rates. I want to show you, in fact, that part of that is a statistical artifact. And I want to go back now not to ask who is a low-income country now, because people who are low-income countries now have been selected for failure. They are the people who did badly. It's not surprising then that the numbers show that. If we want to think about policy and influencing this, we want to ask, how is current status as a low-income country going to affect your growth going forward? And to do that, of course, we can't look into the future, so we need to take a step back in time. And I'm looking now at the countries that are classified as low income in 1962. I haven't got time to go into the details of how we do it, but in fact, however you do this classification, the story is pretty much the same. So now I want to ask what happened to the countries that were low income countries compared with lower middle, upper middle and high income countries in 1962. And the answer is, if you look at the growth column, in fact, everyone pretty much grew at the same rate. If you look at the standard deviations, it suggests that growth is still more volatile for low and lower middle income countries than for upper middle and high income countries. But the idea that low income countries can't grow is actually just an artifact of the fact that you tend to look at the current definition, which tells you who hasn't grown, not who when you started was not going to grow. And that's one of the important things, it seems to me, to carry on into this discussion. Okay, so now think about this same definition. We're thinking about the countries that were low-income countries in 1962. And two things on this diagram. First, what proportion of years since 1962 have they had positive growth? For low-income countries, it's 71%. For high-income countries, it's 90%, increasing gradient. That's on the left-hand side. So it does suggest that low-income countries have more periods of declining growth, or negative growth, than high-income countries. Look at the table on the right, and that averages the years of the growth rate in years of positive growth and averages the growth rate in years of negative growth. And the story basically is that low-income countries grow faster than any other country when they grow, but they fall faster, fall harder when they fall. Put those two things together, low-income countries typically do appear to have deeper recessions, deeper downturns, and more frequent recessions, more frequent downturns. And that is part of the policy story I think we need to look at. But the basic point I want to make is that low-income countries can grow. It's not that they can't grow. We did two exercises just to ask how important would it be to try and eliminate these downturns. One, we asked what would happen if you halved the number of years in which low-income countries have negative growth. Just replace half the negative values by 0. So that push that sort of percentage of positive or 0 growth up to 86%. And secondly, to ask what would happen if in the periods of negative growth, instead of falling by 4.5%, they fell by 2.25%. The basic story is that that increases from here, the blue line, which is the sort of the actual growth rate that we've got for this sample of countries, up to the one in the middle. I'm not very good at colours. It would add something like 0.5 percentage point to their annual growth rate. So sorting out downturns, halving the frequency or depth of downturns would add about 0.5 percentage point on average to growth rates. If we could eliminate downturns altogether, quite impossible, but dream on, if you could do it, it would add slightly over 1 percentage point per annum. The conclusion that we drew from this was that for sure you want to think about eliminating or trying to mitigate downturns, but it's not the only thing you want to do. Given that almost every story we have about economic growth suggests that you can grow faster if you start from a lower base, there is also the job that we can get 1% perhaps by eliminating downturns. We could probably get another 1% by working on underlying factors that determine growth. Oh, wrong way. So 2 ways to stronger low-income growth: mitigating downturns and raising the underlying growth rate. Mitigating downturns, the sort of things that we get in the literature that seem to be associated with upswings and downswings. On the right-hand side, growth collapses associated with declines in exports. Economic flexibility and good institutions seem to help you get out of downturns quicker. On the left-hand side, what do we associate with accelerating growth, sort of short, medium term, over a couple of years and lasting for 5 years? Economic reform, political change, terms of trade shocks, financial liberalisation. They all seem to have an effect. This is work based on Ricardo Hausmann's work on growth strategies. What do we get from sustained long-run growth? 5 characteristics from the Growth Commission of the countries which have had long-run sustained growth: serious engagement with the world economy, macroeconomic stability, high savings and investment, using markets, not governments, to allocate resources, and committed, credible and capable governments. Governments that can observe, that can respond, that think hard, that tailor growth strategies to local requirements. A very important quote from Michael Spence, who was chairman of the Growth Commission: there are no recipes, just ingredients. We can't write down the formula, do this and you will grow with certainty. However, we do know some of the things that seem to be associated with growth. What should we say? More often than not, that we get positive correlations on. So no one is saying, do it like this, it'll be fine. But there's plenty of evidence to say, think about doing some of these things, and it's likely that eventually you will get some sort of growth payoff. What are these things? We focused on 6 of them, which sort of lead into the G20 discussion, at least to some extent: trade and openness, macro stability, infrastructure, financial sector development, human development and skills. The important common theme among those is they are either about investment themselves per se, or they are things that encourage people to invest or firms to invest. And so investment is the sort of important chain link in this argument. Trade and openness, with very strong evidence, I think, of a causal relationship from openness to income levels. And it certainly does require for low-income countries that they achieve some sort of adequate level of labour market institutions, of business regulation, education and so on. But even at really rather low levels of income, there are positive returns to engaging with the world economy. Macro stability, inflation seems to be strongly associated with growing rather weakly. An important element of macro stability, however, is what we've seen in the last 2 years. One of the important things in the recent crisis, I've argued in this very room, is that the IMF and other financial institutions lent much more generously to low-income countries and to other countries when they hit trouble. And we need to think about sort of trying to lock that in, something that G20 basically could do if it had the willpower, and that's the financial safety net story. Infrastructure, we know there are huge returns to a lot of infrastructure investment, varies from country to country. One caveat, it does require proper regulation. No point having power stations if you haven't got a grid and if you're not regulating that industry properly. No point building roads if the trucking sector is so cartelized that the roads just lead to increased profits for truckers rather than lower trading costs for other people. Financial development, some reasonable evidence that financial development certainly boosts growth. Whether financial access, taking finance right down to the lowest elements, does, I think we have got less strong evidence about, but it certainly is a useful distributional tool anyway. We have evidence that greater financial depth helps countries cope with sort of normal volatility, not avoiding crises. In fact, financial development, financial depth is not always a good way of avoiding crises, but the day-to-day sort of fluctuations, sort of things in my diagram, they are helped by financial depth. Human development, very clear micro story, bit more difficult to pin down the macro story, but is almost certainly there. It is impossible to persuade yourself, I'd suggest, that we're not richer today, partly because we have better health and better education than our Victorian forebears. But difficult to pin down actually analytically. Finally, and on that it's important to notice, however, there's no point in having skilled and healthy workers unless you can also organise the world in such a way that they can do something useful. So skilled workers need to be occupied. This is, go back to the Hindu rate of growth and worry about that sort of thing. So we do need to think about the productive sector in order to make use of those skills. Finally, skills, important that we think in terms of employability, not just philosophy degrees, but sort of technical skills and cognitive behavioural skills. One of the other features of these things is not only that they're about investment, but they're mostly rather knowledge intensive. They actually take some sophistication to have an infrastructure fund or know how to organise the tertiary education sector. And so we would argue strongly that there is room for a knowledge sharing institution for G20 to help try and set this up. Not so that old farts like me go and lecture people, but so essentially policymakers in different countries can exchange experience and can learn from each other. Finally, I haven't really mentioned it, but tucked away in the paper that this is based on is a good deal of work arguing about institutions. We can't avoid the fact that good governance also is part of the growth story. If you were interested, there's a website address down there for the paper on which this is based, a working paper from University of Sussex, number 8. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to hear you so dismissive of your own Victorian ancestors. Mine all had PhDs in nuclear physics. Just make the link just to the G20 before you stop in 2 sentences, because we don't have much time. I mean, why is this a good agenda for the G20, and what can the G20 do about it?
It's a good agenda for the G20 because there is nobody else who is focusing particularly much on growth, and I think growth is the key. Infrastructure funds, G20 can help set that up. The knowledge exchange so far as education, human development is concerned. So far as the financial safety net, the G20 has that within its power to do it. I mean, for sure you might do it through the IMF, but the G20 tells the IMF to do it, it will get done. So in each of those areas, one can identify a number of things in a generic sort of way. I'm not writing and I'm not proposing to the G20 very specific policy prescriptions. That's not what I was asked to do. I mean, we can clearly move on to that. But in fact, that one can identify a role for G20 in each of those areas.
Okay, that's something we might want to come back to